We're back with our political panel. Juliet Eilperin is a senior national correspondent for the Washington Post. Ron Brownstein is the editorial director for Atlantic Media. We're also joined by CBS News political analyst and Slate Magazine's chief political correspondent, Jamelle Bouie, and Ben Domenech, who is the publisher of The Federalist. Juliet, I want to start with you. What happened this week on healthcare?
What you really saw was an extraordinary moment of gamesmanship where President Trump delivered an ultimatum to House Republicans, dared them to take a vote and pass the bill that they've been working on for a couple of weeks. And at the end of the day, Paul Ryan, the speaker, had to come down and admit that he could not force his members to walk the plank for this proposal, and at this point acknowledged that the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land for the foreseeable future.
Ben, what's the lesson here coming out of this for Republicans?
There are a number of lessons. So, John, prior to my work with The Federalist, I worked for 12 years in health policy. I was in the Bush administration at HHS during the Medicare Part D fight, and then in the Senate and saw that play out. There's a major difference between the politics then and the politics now. Part D was a popular measure. This measure had 17% approval in the most recent poll taken about it. During the Part D fight, leadership had earmarks that they could use to offer different members carrots in order to support their measure, keeping a vote open in one instance in the House for 3 hours. Now they no longer have that. GOP leadership needs to recognize the lesson that they can take away from this moment, which is that the Freedom Caucus and what it represents, fiscal conservatives who have support in their districts, support that far outpaces the President of the United States, are here to stay, and they are a large enough faction to be able to get what they want done. The fact is that, today Adam Kinzinger, a representative from Illinois, came out and said he thought that leadership should take the lesson that they should abandon dealing with these conservatives and instead reach out to centrist Democrats, to which I say it's fun to play pretend. The reality is that this faction is not going away, and in order to include them in the process, to bring them in, to not draft legislation behind closed doors, you have to have a more open, a more collaborative process that includes them and other stakeholder groups from the get-go. The real hard problem that leadership has to face is that it wasn't just conservatives who killed this bill, it wasn't just the Heritage Foundation that opposed it, it was the AARP, it was every major medical group,
hospitals,
everyone. If you had 7 years to put that together, how could you even make that happen?
It was a panoramic collapse, right? Because you're talking about, first of all, it is difficult to think of another new president who has lost a legislative fight this big, this fast in their presidency. It is really hard to think.
Now,
of
people would
example.
say Clinton, so explain why.
Well, Clinton ultimately passed his budget. He lost health care, in the second year, ultimately, the end of 1993, 1994. But to be 60 days into your presidency and have something of this magnitude, the first big thing that Clinton did, it was very difficult, but he did pass it in the end. Of course, President Obama passed the stimulus. George W. Bush passed the No Child Left Behind and the tax cut. But I think what's really important here is Ben's point, that it was not just the conservatives in the end who bolted. In fact, as Tom Cotton noted to you, that in most of the whip counts, there were more people outside of the Freedom Caucus who opposed the bill than those who were inside. And to me, there was one of the big lessons here, beside all the tactical problems, and I think we should go back at the question of whether it's possible to work with Democrats, because the decision not to, in effect, gave a veto to each faction in the Republican Party. But bigger than any of that, facts on the ground matter.
Right.
Obamacare provided coverage for 20 million people, and the fundamental division in the Republican Party was conservatives who wanted to take it away from more, faster, who would not have created anything like that entitlement, and then those both moderate, centrist, and even some conservatives who said, I have hundreds of thousands of people in my state or my district who've gained coverage, and we cannot simply pull the rug out from under them.
I think you can't underestimate what the effect of Democratic mobilization on the ground had on more moderate Republicans, more vulnerable members who were seeing angry people at their town halls, who were seeing mass protests, and decided, I risk losing my seat. I risk incurring some sort of political damage by voting for a bill whose headline number on this bill was that 24 million people would lose their insurance. And added to that, I think it's important to recognize that in addition to tactical mistakes and strategic mistakes, there's just the fact that the bill was just a shoddy bill.
And
it was a bad bill.
And you can't underestimate the fact that there was no negotiation and what that means, that yes, you have mobilization on the ground. I was talking to a healthcare lobbyist yesterday who said it's not that they shut their doors and they didn't take our calls. but they didn't solicit our input, and more importantly, there wasn't a negotiation, and so you had no buy-in from all of these other constituencies.
Well,
and it really,
to the extent there was a negotiation, when things were taken out of it to buy off the Freedom Caucus, you lost those models we were talking about.
It was a flailing.
And in the same sense, even those things that were taken out, a lot of it, the real question that I had as a health policy person when I looked at this was not an ideological question. I have my own positions when it comes to health policy. It was more about workability. Is this even going to work? And I think in this sense, you were asking, this past week, for all these members of Congress to come out and vote for something that they didn't have a final CBO score for, that they really didn't know how it would apply to their districts. And you can look at the Senate schedule going forward. They're going to do Montenegro next, and they're going to do Gorsuch, and then there's going to be a recess, and then they're going to do a CR, and all of those things mean House members will be flailing for 5 weeks defending a bill that they didn't even fully understand.
And we talked about this before, what I wrote, the Trump Care Conundrum in January. I mean, the core problem here is the basic solution on the private market side. Leave aside the fact that half the people who gained coverage under Obamacare were under the expansion of Medicaid, which is a really separate issue that Republicans wanted to repeal. But on the private market side, the core solution that Republicans have was to deregulate insurance in a variety of different ways, and the individual mandate, ultimately, and the essential health benefits. And what that does over and over again is advantage younger, healthier, and raise costs and diminish access for people, older people with larger health needs. And that is their coalition at this point. The reality is 60% of House Republicans are in districts that are older than the national average, and a majority of Donald Trump's votes came from whites over 45. CBO said people in their 50s would have a 25% premium increase and would suffer much of the coverage loss. They were colliding with their new coalition. You remember in healthcare in the 90s, they twice passed a block grant for Medicaid under Bill Clinton without fuss or muss among Republicans. Now it's a lot of their voters who get hit by that.
And the president said he would never support a bill that hurt his own voters. But then in the horse trading that was going on, there seemed to be nothing. It was a little bit on the tax credit for older people, but nothing that would get to the problems that you identified. Juliet, let me ask you about the president as a marketer. We know what the president looks like when he has got something on his mind. It is a constant conversation. Measure Donald Trump at 100% to the President Donald Trump who worked on this bill.
Right. I mean, this was really a different person in some ways, partially because he had deep ambivalence about this legislation. He kept asking his own advisors whether this was a good bill, and part of it was this was not his comfort zone. This is not an area which he prioritized in his own campaign, aside from saying that he wanted to reverse it. And so he did, they can trot out that he talked on the phone or in person to 120 members, but he basically was just making these incredibly broad arguments of you need to vote for this, and we're telling you to vote for it. And as a result, you didn't have the public communication or even kind of the detailed private communication. That's what you need to bring it across the
In order to be an effective advocate, a president actually has to know something about the policies in question. And Donald Trump hasn't shown that he has that knowledge, and so it makes it difficult for him to advocate in public, to advocate to members. And it means that in these negotiations and horse trading, and we've seen reporting to say exactly this, he doesn't really have anything to say or add.
But the fact is that Paul Ryan has been working on this for 7 years. He was working on it when Donald Trump was still a reality star. He should have expected better.
I'm going to take a quick break there. I want to get back to this very dynamic between the president and Paul Ryan. It's going to matter going forward. So let's take a short break, and we'll be right back. Stay with us. And we're back with our panel. Ben, pick up where you were.
So the issue I think that you really have to look at right now is the relationship that Donald Trump and the White House has with Paul Ryan. This really was a situation where they outsourced their policy to him and other Republican leaders who've been working on this process for 7 years. They could have expected a much better outcome from that leadership. I think it's not irrational to expect that. My sources who are close to the White House tell me that Reince Priebus, who is obviously very close with Paul Ryan, the White House Chief of Staff, is now on extremely shaky ground, that the president really doubts him and was assured by him multiple times through this process that things were going well, that they were going to come out of this with a bill. Obviously, that didn't work out, and it's really a question of where he stands.
This whole episode, I think, revealed what a shotgun marriage it is between Donald Trump's economic nationalism and the more conventional small government conservatism or even libertarianism that Ryan represents, because there was a direct collision between this bill. A few days earlier in the budget, President Trump made a big statement. He said, I am going to depart from traditional Republican thinking and exempt Social Security and Medicare from any changes, which has been Paul Ryan's biggest crusade, particularly on Medicare. And because those are my voters, because a majority of my votes came from whites over 45, and we have a lot of lower middle income, older, predominantly white voters who now depend on those programs, and I'm going to deviate or redirect Republican ideology. Then you come back a few days later with a bill that hammers those very same voters, that is driven by Ryan. And it is a reminder that in a variety of ways, you're going to see, I think, a consistent collision between the economic nationalism that Trump is embracing, which in many cases, in most countries around the world, includes a pretty big government component, and the traditional Republican drive to shrink government over all other goals.
I think there's an important point about process to make here, though. It is true that Paul Ryan and House leadership should have had a better sense of how to go forward because they've been working on this for 7 years. But we're also living in an age where the presidency is pretty involved in policy matters. And a White House has to have policy expertise. It has to have some sort of knowledge and know-how about how to get these things done. And the fact of the matter is that not only does the Trump White House not have these things, it has a lot of people new, not just to national politics or government, but new to just policymaking, period. But Donald Trump himself, if you look at his career as a businessman, what he is skilled at is branding. Putting his name on a bill that the House produced is 100% what you'd expect Donald Trump to do. And I'm not sure, I think this may demonstrate that Trump himself does not actually have the kinds of skills necessary to shepherd these kinds of big legislative programs through.
To give it the special sauce, he gave everybody a name during the campaign.
Right.
He was quite expert at that. Make America Great Again, had a punch to it. This never got a name from...
Right, he didn't want it called Trump Care. He did not want that.
Although, and Julia, take this from where we are in healthcare and where this goes forward, but with this idea, couldn't Paul Ryan say, hey, if we had this Freedom Caucus, we knew they were going to be a challenge. They have always been. Right. Donald Trump could have done rallies in their districts. He could have, instead of giving them an ultimatum at the end, could he have started earlier? And what does this mean for going forward, either with healthcare or tax reform or anything else?
Absolutely. I mean, and also interestingly, the leverage that he that he was kind of exercising at the end, this idea that, look, I'm going to put you on the spot, you'll take the blame for this going down, and I'm popular in your states. As Ben points out, that's both not as effective with Freedom Caucus members, the most conservatives, but also, again, he's not following through on that threat. That was his leverage, and instead he wants to blame the Democrats and say that it's going to explode.
We should revisit Ben's point from, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, just that, so there's no question that he could have invested more, and his ambivalence hampered it, his unwillingness to essentially license it in the way he has done other things. And I think going forward, again, particularly when you have these ideological crosscurrents, he's got to decide what he is going to fully invest in, do that kind of politics, both outside the Beltway, where he has enormous skill, and figure out how to have enough involvement and enough buy-in that he can effectively sell it here.
Because Ben said earlier that it was a fantasy, really, to believe that you could bring in some Democrats. But one lesson of this clearly is if you are starting from the get-go, assuming that you're going to have no Democratic support, in essence, you are giving a veto to each faction in the Republican coalition. So it does raise the question. I mean, it was never even discussed here. It was like never even really an option to kind of reach out to Democrats. But going forward on tax reform in particular, where you have this enormous divide again over this idea of the import adjustment fee, and Tom Cotton, who you had earlier, he can't be senator from Arkansas with Walmart be against, a foreign import. That's an idea that just seems like a non-starter in the Senate. They are going to be in the same position structurally where each side of the party can veto this unless they can find a way to bring in some Democrats.
Which is why I think you have to have a more open process that brings people in beforehand, that doesn't just try to legislate from on high. The fact is that when you've heard leadership in both houses of Congress complain about this new brand of conservatism over the past several years, but these people are not going away. This is the way things are now, and you have to recognize that. And it's clear now after this experience, Donald Trump is not going to solve that for you. The people who would be challenging these Freedom Caucus members in their districts would be challenging them from the right, not from the center. And that's a reality that you have to come to grips with. You can't just keep playing pretend.
But a more open process only with Republicans?
I think it has to include other people as well. It has to include Democrats in districts where Donald Trump performed well, which includes several Democrats who are in the House.
12 Democrats in the House.
Exactly. And that's the kind of people who I think you need to be looking at going forward, who are going to have to run again in a year. What are the issues that voters in their districts care about? Where can they be moved?
But Jamelle, are those Democrats who are going to play and join in, given where the Democratic base is right now, which is anything you do to work with Donald Trump is normalizing him? I mean, the rhetoric coming from the left.
Right. I have a hard time believing that any Democrats, even Democrats in districts that Trump won, are going to want to risk working with the Trump administration, with Republicans, to advance Trump's political interests. My sense is that any Democrat who takes that step will immediately face the wrath of much of the Democratic base. And so in this case, I do think an open process is just going to have to be among Republicans. And again, I am not sure that the Trump White House is really ready to make these kinds of adjustments. I mean, they want to go from an issue that involves a sixth of the economy to an issue that involves the entire economy. And they want to do so like quickly. And I'm really skeptical that they'll be able to make the kinds of on-the-ground changes they need to make that successful.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks all of you for being with us. Thank you, all of you out there, for watching us, and we'll be right back.